All right, welcome to today's review. We are covering ecology today. Ecology is the study of interactions between organisms and their environment. And it's important to know that organisms and their environment are what we call interdependent. So, what this means is that every organism in an ecosystem relies on every other organism to survive. And so, the example that I provide here is a snail. So, a snail couldn't survive without the producers that it eats, the plants and the algae, and then the plants and the algae would not grow without the soil bacteria that's so important for nitrogen fixation. So again, every organism relies on every other organism, and we call this interdependence. So the study of ecology just ranges from the study of individual organisms, like you see in this picture, to the study of an entire planet, which we refer to as the biosphere. Now, when we are reviewing ecology, it's important to note that there is tons of vocabulary. So we're going to review some of the vocabulary that we discussed this year in our ecology unit, and then we'll start kind of tying in some overarching concepts. So first, a species is just an individual organism that can interbreed with each other. And so what this means is that members of the same species can mate and produce what's called fertile offspring. Populations, so this is a group of organisms of one species that lives together in the same place at the same time. Communities, so these are two or more populations of different species that occupy the same place. Now, this only includes your biotic factors. So these are living or once living factors in an ecosystem. The components of a community are going to interact with one another, and it is important to know that if there is a change in one population, it can dramatically affect the others within the community. So communities do focus on biotic factors. If we add in the abiotic factors, then we have what's called an ecosystem. So the biotic, living, and the abiotic, which are the non-living factors in an area, make up an ecosystem. We also have biomes. Now, it's not important to know specific biomes and have those memorized, but you do need to know that biome is a biological community that's formed in response to its physical environment and then its regional climate. And then we have the biosphere, the combination of every ecosystem on the planet. And so our biosphere is Earth, and the biosphere includes all the living beings and their relationships with one another, which is the whole concept of ecology. We kept the focus on interactions between organisms and their environment. All right, so what we're going to do as we go through this review session is I'm going to post a question. So you'll see the question and the question icon on your screen. And then these are questions that you need to be able to answer. And so we'll go through each of the answers to these questions that I'm going to post. So the first question is, what can we find in an ecosystem? So you need to know, we've mentioned already in this review session the difference between biotic and abiotic factors, but just make sure that you're clear that biotic factors include the living components of an ecosystem. So this might be your plants, your animals, bacteria, fungi, and then your abiotic factors are your non-living components in an ecosystem. So this could be sunlight, rocks. We talked about the importance of rocks when we talked about the phosphorus cycle this year, water, temperature, the pH of the soil. So if I were to ask you, is this plant considered biotic or abiotic? You should be able to tell me biotic. And if I were referring to this body of water's salinity or its temperature, then you would tell me that that's an abiotic factor. And then if I showed you a picture of lichens on a tree, hopefully you would be able to tell me that this is an example of a biotic factor. You also need to know what a habitat is. So this is a specific ecological area that's inhabited by a specific plant or animal species. And then we know these plant and animal species have a niche. So a niche is just a role or a job that a species plays in its community. We talked a lot about the kelp forest in our ecology unit this year in biology. The kelp forest has a super important role, a super important niche. Not only is it a producer that provides food for organisms like sea urchins, but it also is a whole community within itself. So tons of organisms live and thrive here. They find shelter amongst the kelp forest. They can hide from predators. So the niche of the kelp forest is its job, like what its role in the community is. All right, our next question is, what are some factors that affect ecosystems? So you need to be able to kind of talk through these factors and how they might affect an ecosystem. So size. Is the ecosystem large? Is it small? Does it have enough space to accommodate the organisms in the ecosystem? Carrying capacity. So this is the number of organisms that can be supported in an ecosystem. So is the carrying capacity high or low, or is there enough space to accommodate all the organisms? Response to limiting factors. So limiting factors are anything that limits population size. This could be disease, predators in an area. This could be lack of space, lack of food, lack of water. So how organisms respond to these limiting factors is going to affect ecosystems. Keystone species, we talked about this year. Keystone species are like the glue of the ecosystem. And if you remove a keystone species, it affects the entire ecosystem. And so we talked about the wolves of Yellowstone, how they were a keystone species. But I put a picture of an owl here because owls are also considered keystone species. Because if you think about a food web that includes an owl, all the things that an owl eats, or maybe the predators of an owl. If you were to remove the owl from the ecosystem, it creates a chain reaction of things that affects the entire ecosystem. So this is why something like an owl would be considered a keystone species. When you remove a keystone species from the ecosystem, it could result in a trophic cascade. So that we talked about that this year. We studied the sea urchins and the otters. The sea otters were considered a keystone species that were important to their ecosystem. And when they disappeared, that affected the sea urchin population, which in turn affected the kelp forest. And so we see this sort of cause and effect relationship between these keystone species and the rest of the ecosystem. The next question is, how do ecosystems rebuild themselves after a disturbance? So it's important to note that ecosystems can change, they can be disturbed. And so in some cases, like with a volcanic eruption or when a glacier retreats, an ecosystem has to start fresh. And when it starts fresh and has to rebuild itself on bare rock, we call this primary succession. So this is an area that's newly exposed or contains newly formed rock, and it's colonized by living things for the first time. And remember, these organisms that colonize first are called pioneer species. So these are the first species that are going to show up in an ecosystem. That's your lichens and bacteria, and then your small little plants and grasses. And they're important to establishing that climax community because they're going to create soil out of this bare rock. So as those lichens and bacteria work and decompose, they create good, rich, organic soil. And that allows the grasses and the bushes to grow. And then when those things die and decompose and the decomposers go to work, then you have room for your more intermediate species, like some little shrubs and trees. And then, of course, over time, we get a climax community where we can have our hardwood trees. Again, more shrubs, but they're going to be sturdier shrubs and these shade-tolerant trees like oaks and hickories. Now, secondary succession, this is where we're going to have a disturbance. An area that was previously occupied will become disturbed. So this could be a forest fire, a tornado, a tsunami. So we have a disturbance, and then the ecosystem is going to recolonize following that disturbance. And it starts on soil. So it's different from primary succession because we're not starting on rock. We already have soil established. And so this is going to happen a little quicker. The same process happens. Your pioneer species come first, then your intermediate species, and of course at the end you get a climax community, but it's going to happen a little quicker than it did with primary succession. So the takeaway here is that ecosystems are constantly changing. The next question that we want to try to answer is, how does energy flow through an ecosystem? So remember, the ultimate source of energy for most ecosystems is the sun. And energy flow can be visualized in 3 different ways, or there's 3 that we talked about this year. So with food chains, this is a more simplistic version of energy flow. A food web is more complex. It shows multiple relationships, multiple feeding relationships. And then we have a trophic pyramid, and the shape of that pyramid reminds us that as we move up the pyramid, several things are going to decrease. So the number of organisms will decrease, the biomass will decrease, and the energy that's available will decrease. I do want to look at a food web because I want to point something out. So if you look at the relationships between these organisms in the food web, you can see we have a producer, and then your primary consumers are going to be organisms that feed on the producer. And then you have like your secondary consumers and then your tertiary consumer. And you'll notice these arrows here. So just a reminder, the arrows show the flow of energy in the ecosystem. So here the snail is going to feed on the producer. And so this just shows that the energy that the producer has will be transferred to the snail when the snail consumes the producer. The takeaway here is that organisms within an ecosystem depend on one another. So again, I mentioned earlier that this is a great way to also show cause and effect relationships. So if I were to remove one component of this food web, you need to be able to answer the question, how would that affect other members of the food web? This is a trophic pyramid, so we start with our producers at the bottom, and then primary consumers come next. These are things that feed on the producers, and then your organisms that feed on the primary consumers are going to be called secondary consumers, and then organisms that feed on the secondary consumers are called tertiary consumers. And so I put a little 10% here to remind you about the rule of 10. So as we move from one trophic level to the next, 10% of that energy is going to be transferred to the next level. 90% of that energy is going to be lost to metabolic processes and heat. So all the cell processes that we talked about this year that organisms have to go through, and the metabolism that the organisms need to burn off this energy, 90% of that will be lost. Excuse me. Just a reminder that energy isn't recycled in an ecosystem. So as you move from producer level up through tertiary consumer, the energy that a tertiary consumer has isn't recycled back into the producer level. So energy is not recycled, but matter is, and we'll talk about that in a future slide. Also remember that some of the energy transferred to the next is transferred to the next trophic level. Specifically, we learned this year 10%. But 90% of the energy is transferred to heat in the form of like respiration and metabolism. And most of the energy available in a healthy ecosystem is contained at the producer level. So in a healthy ecosystem, we're going to see more producers than we are anything else. More producers than primary consumers, more producers than secondary consumers or tertiary consumers. I mentioned this before, but just make sure that you remember as we move up from one trophic level to the next, 3 things decrease. And this is why we have the pyramid shape, to remind us that as you go upward, the available energy decreases, the number of organisms decreases, and then the biomass decreases. And I just want to remind you that the term biomass is just the mass of the living biological organisms in a given area at a given time. And biomass can refer to species biomass, which is the mass of one or more species, or it can be community biomass, which is the mass of all the species that exist in a community. I do want to do a little practice problem with you. So suppose 3,000 kilocalories of energy is available at the primary consumer level. So that's right here. How much energy would be available to the tertiary consumer? So we're thinking we have the primary consumer, and then we're going to see how much energy the tertiary consumer would receive if it ate the secondary consumer that ate the primary consumer. So remember, 10% rule. If we go from primary consumers to secondary consumers, 10% is going to travel. So we're starting at 3,000. I tell my students just move the decimal one place to the left. So 3,000 will become 300. So secondary consumer is going to consume 300 kilocalories of energy. And then when the tertiary consumer eats that secondary consumer, it will get another 10%, or it will absorb 10% of the available 300 kilocalories of energy. So 10% of 300 is 30. So 30 kilocalories would be our answer. What if I said an owl at the tertiary consumer level obtains 23 joules of energy from an organism that it consumes, which obviously would be our secondary consumer level? How much energy was available initially to the owl? So we want to know how much energy was available at the secondary consumer level. And so we're going to work in reverse. So if we move the decimal one place to the left to move up the pyramid, if we're going to go down the pyramid, we're going to move that decimal to the right one place. So 23 joules would become 230 joules. All right, so I just want to walk through our trophic pyramid, each of our levels, and just remind you of some things that we talked about this year. So producers are also known as autotrophs. These are organisms that produce food for themselves and also other organisms. And what these producers do is via photosynthesis, they use sunlight and simple inorganic molecules like carbon dioxide to make organic compounds like sugar, glucose. The stability of producers is vital to ecosystems because all organisms need organic molecules. This is the way that consumers get the phosphorus they need, the carbon that they need, the nitrogen that they need, all of those important bionutrients. And so producers are so important to an ecosystem. Now, there are two types of autotrophs. We have our photoautotrophs that go through photosynthesis. They're going to use energy from the sun to make food via photosynthesis. And these are our plants and our algae and then certain bacteria. And then other bacteria are known as chemoautotrophs, and they're going to use energy from chemical compounds to make their food by a process called chemosynthesis. Consumers are also known as heterotrophs. These are organisms that depend on other organisms for food. So we have consumers that eat producers. Those are our primary consumers. And then we have consumers that eat other consumers. These are our secondary and tertiary consumers. So they are going to take in organic molecules by eating other living things. This includes all animals and then fungi, but fungi don't really eat. They more so absorb nutrients. Now, heterotrophs are classified by what they eat, and just a quick reminder, your herbivores are going to consume producers. This would be like deer and rabbits and mice. And then we have carnivores, which they consume animals, lions and polar bears and hawks and salmon would be great examples of carnivores. And then your omnivores consume both plants and animals. This would be like humans and pigs and bears, crows, and then, of course, some species of fish. And last but not least, some of the most important organisms found in an ecosystem are our decomposers. So when organisms die, they leave behind energy and matter in their remains, and included in those remains is good organic compounds. And so decomposers are going to be the organisms that are responsible for breaking down those remains and other waste, and they're going to release these simple inorganic molecules back into the environment. And then producers, of course, are going to pick those up, absorb those, and then use those molecules to make new organic compounds. So the takeaway here is the stability of decomposers is essential to every ecosystem. Now, decomposers are classified by the type of organic matter that they break down. So you can have scavengers, which consume soft tissues of dead animals. These are like your buzzards that live around here, vultures, raccoons, blowflies. We have detritivores. They're going to feed on dead leaves and animal feces and just other organic debris that collects in the soil. Great example of detritivores are earthworms, dung beetles, and then in an aquatic ecosystem, your bottom feeders, so like your sea cucumbers and your catfish. And then we have saprotrophs. They're going to be like the final step in decomposition. They're going to feed on any remaining organic matter that's left after decomposers come in and do their work. So this is going to be like fungi and bacteria and some single-celled protozoa. All right, now let's talk about biogeochemical cycles, because I've hinted around at these cycles several times already in this review session. But now we want to answer the question, how does matter move through an ecosystem? So earlier we said energy isn't recycled, but matter is. And so now we want to focus on how matter moves through an ecosystem. And so this year we talked about the carbon cycle. We started talking about the carbon cycle early this year when we talked about macromolecules and how carbon is found in all of our macromolecules. So remember, chan, chomp. So carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins all contain carbon. So carbon is super important for all organisms. And then we focused on carbon when we talked about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And then when we got to our ecosystem unit in ecology, we talked about the carbon cycle as a biogeochemical cycle. So just make sure that you can understand a carbon cycle depiction or illustration like you see here. And most importantly, if I were to ask you the question, how is carbon put into the atmosphere? Can you tell me through the burning of fossil fuels or through factory emissions or when we drive our cars, those emissions? Carbon dioxide is put into the atmosphere during cellular respiration and even diffusion. And if I were to ask you, how is carbon removed from the atmosphere? Can you tell me that it's removed via photosynthesis, where producers pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in order to create glucose? Another important biogeochemical cycle is the nitrogen cycle. So if you'll just study this picture so that you see all the different ways that nitrogen can be absorbed or picked up or transformed. Again, nitrogen is extremely important for all living organisms. And if you'll remember, 78% of the Earth's atmosphere is actually made of nitrogen gas, but it's an unusable form of nitrogen. And so we really rely on lightning and some bacteria that's found in the soil, and bacteria that's found in the roots of some plants like legumes. We really rely on those bacteria to convert that atmospheric nitrogen that we can't use into a usable form. And then once it's converted into a usable form through nitrogen fixation, then our producers can pick up that nitrogen. And then, of course, our consumers are going to come consume those producers, and when they do that, the nitrogen is pushed into the consumer, and so you start to see this cycle. Remember that plants use nitrogen compounds for proteins and nucleic acids. So again, chan, chomp. The chan, the N in chan, and the N in chomp stands for nitrogen. The phosphorus cycle is something that we focused on this year. So again, just make sure that you study this picture and you can kind of understand all the ways that phosphorus is put into the ecosystem, and then the ways that it might be taken out. Phosphorus, remember, it doesn't exist in the atmosphere. It has to be dissolved from rocks and sediments that contain calcium phosphate. And so when we have weathering and erosion, then the water carries those phosphates into streams and rivers and into the soil, where, of course, the producers pick those up. And then very similar to the nitrogen cycle, it just kind of goes through from the producer to the consumer. And then when the consumer dies or produces feces, that phosphorus then goes into the soil and then back to the producer. Why is phosphorus important? Well, it's important for our nucleic acids. So remember, CHOMP, that's our nucleic acids. It contains carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and then the P stands for phosphorus. The water cycle is also super important. Just make sure that you kind of understand all the different terms that are included in the water cycle. Our next question is, how do populations impact ecosystems? So population ecology is the study of how populations just change over time and interact with their environment. And so they're described by characteristics that include population size, which is the number of individuals in the population. We can talk about population ecology in terms of population density, which is how many individuals are in an area. And then we talked a lot this year about population growth, so how the size of a population is changing over time. How do populations impact ecosystems? Well, an increase in one population can cause a decrease in another. And so we spent some time this year talking about the wolves of Yellowstone, and we watched a video called How Wolves Change Rivers. And it talked us through when wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park, this reduced the number of the elk population, because the predator was the wolf and then the prey was the elk. And these elk were feeding on the banks of the river. They were feeding on these grasses on the banks. And so when you decrease the number of elk, these grasses started to grow back, and it created a structure that sort of acted as a I guess a buffer for the water. And so ultimately, the wolves kind of indirectly changed the path of the rivers and the stability of the riverbanks. A change in population size is known as a growth rate, and then a growth rate can be positive, negative, or zero. And we talked a lot about graphs this year. So if a population is provided with ideal conditions, of course, it's going to increase in number. And so healthy organisms reproduce at a greater rate than their death rate, and this is going to create population growth. Sometimes that growth is exponential. So you can see here in a J-curved graph, this shows exponential growth. And as long as these ideal conditions are met, the population will continue to grow larger and larger. And of course, this is called exponential growth, but growth rates do have limits. So as populations increase, resources are depleted, resources are used up. And so we have this term called carrying capacity, which is the number of individuals that the environment can support given the resources that are available. So if populations exceed their carrying capacity, the organisms in that ecosystem may not be able to get the resources that they need to survive. And so the ecosystem will sort of regulate itself. If it rises above carrying capacity, it won't do so for long because of the number of resources. They'll be depleted, and then organisms will start to die off. And this leads us to limiting factors. So anything that limits the population is considered a limiting factor. So this could be space, food, water that's available, how many predators are in an area, competition, human disturbances. Don't forget, limiting factors are what determines carrying capacity. Another question that we need to be able to answer is, how do human activities impact ecosystems? So humans do quite a number on ecosystems, you can see from this picture. And all environmental change impacts the stability of the ecosystem. Organisms are limited in their ability to survive within a changing environment. Sometimes they don't. And so you have extinction, or you have organisms that are forced to migrate or relocate based on these different changes. And a lot of these changes are human involved changes. So temperature, pH, drought, fire, all of these things are changes that can happen to an environment that, of course, would impact the organisms in that ecosystem. Some of the human activities that we talked about this year is chemical use. So we talked about the use of pesticides and how that leads to pesticide resistance. We talked about the overuse of fertilizers and how that can lead to things like algal blooms. We talked about the consumption of natural resources. So we also mentioned our ecological footprint. How are we at using the resources that Earth has provided for us? And so many times I gave the example of deforestation and how that impacts ecosystems, because if you cut down trees, that there's a chain reaction. Not only are the trees homes to many organisms in an ecosystem, but they're also responsible for pulling out carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas. And we talked about greenhouse gases and how the production of carbon dioxide is creating quite a problem. So this contributes to global warming. We also talked about the introduction of non-native species and how this could become invasive species. And invasive species that aren't native to a habitat can destroy the habitat. It can take resources away from the native species that belong in that ecosystem. We also talked about how organisms interact with one another within an ecosystem. So, symbiosis is the word that we use to talk about the relationship between two organisms. And we have different types of symbiosis. So, parasitism, this is where one organism is benefited, but at the expense of another. And then we have commensalism, where one organism benefits and the other is neither harmed nor does it benefit. So it's what we say unaffected. In mutualism, both organisms get a benefit. So these organisms are going to work together. They have a relationship and both gets a little benefit from that relationship. We also have predation. So this is a predator-prey relationship. So this is where one organism is going to hunt, kill, eat another organism. All right, that finishes up our ecology review.